I grew up in a small coastal town where the ocean was a big part of our lives. Fishing, boating, swimming, it was all just a normal part of being a kid there. But the one place everyone avoided was the old pier. It had been condemned years ago, long before I was born. Locals always warned us about it, saying it wasn't safe, that the wood was rotten and the structure was falling apart. But there was more to it than that. Some people whispered about accidents that had happened there, fishermen who had gone missing or been found dead under mysterious circumstances. I never believed those stories, but the pier always gave me the creeps. I hadn't thought about it in years until one summer night when I was back home from college, hanging out with some old friends. We'd had a few drinks and were reminiscing about the stupid things we used to do as kids. That's when someone, probably Mark, suggested we check out the pier. It was just the kind of dumb dare that made sense after a couple of beers. We laughed it off at first, but as the night went on, we decided to do it. It was a warm night, and the idea of revisiting a place we'd all been too scared to go as kids seemed exciting in a strange way. So we grabbed a couple of flashlights and headed down to the beach. The pier looked worse than I remembered. The boards were warped and splintered, parts of the railing had fallen into the water, and the whole structure seemed to creak. We stood there for a moment, staring at it, before Mark, always the bold one, took the first step. "It's fine," he said, but his voice didn't sound as confident as usual. We followed him, stepping carefully on the old wood. It creaked under our feet, and every step felt like it might be our last before the whole thing collapsed into the ocean. The further we went, the more the air around us seemed to change. The warm breeze off the water turned cold, and there was a smell, a mix of salt and something rotten, like fish that had been left out in the sun too long. We made it to the end of the pier, where there used to be a small shack for storing gear. Now it was nothing but a pile of broken boards and rusted nails. The water below us was pitch black, the moonlight barely reflecting off the surface. I remember feeling a sense of unease, like something was watching us, but I tried to shake it off. It was just an old pier. There was nothing to be afraid of. Mark dared me to cast my line off the edge, just like the fishermen used to do. I laughed, but my hands were shaking as I grabbed my rod. I cast out into the darkness. We stood there waiting, but the longer we waited, the more uncomfortable I felt. That's when I heard it, a faint sound, like something tapping on the boards beneath us. I froze listening. It was slow, almost like footsteps, but it wasn't coming from any of us. It was coming from below. I turned to Mark, who was standing a few feet away. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded, his face pale. "Yeah." We shined our flashlights down between the cracks in the pier, but all we could see was water. The tapping continued though, getting louder, more insistent. I could feel the boards vibrating beneath my feet, as if something was moving underneath us. I felt sick, like I was standing on the edge of something I didn't understand. "I think we should go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark didn't argue. We turned to head back, but as soon as we took a step, the tapping stopped. Dead silence. I don't know why, but that silence was worse than the sound itself. It was like the pier was holding its breath, waiting for us to make a move. We walked quickly, careful not to run, trying to keep our footing on the uneven boards. Every step felt like it might be the one that sent us plunging into the water below. The smell was getting worse too, that sickening stench of decay filling the air. Halfway back, Mark stopped suddenly, his flashlight flickering. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, pointing to something ahead of us. I followed the beam of his flashlight and saw it, a shadow moving at the far end of the pier. We froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadow didn't move, but it didn't need to. The mere presence of it sent a wave of fear through me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. All I could do was stare at it. Then, without warning, the shadow disappeared. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, swallowed up by the darkness. That was enough for me. "Let's get out of here," I said, not bothering to keep my voice down anymore. Mark didn't argue. We hurried back to the shore, the sound of our footsteps echoing through the night. By the time we reached solid ground, I was drenched in sweat, my hands shaking. We didn't say much as we walked back to the house. None of us ever went back to the pier after that. We never really talked about what happened that night either. But I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm down by the water. I'll catch myself looking out at it, wondering what we saw, or if we saw anything at all. Maybe it was just our minds playing tricks on us. Or maybe, just maybe, there was something or someone still there waiting in the dark. I've been fishing this same river for years, long as I can remember actually. There's a bend a couple of miles down from where most folks set up, past the old bridge, where the river narrows and gets a little deeper. Hardly anyone goes down that way anymore. The currents are unpredictable, and more than a few boats have been wrecked by the rocks hidden just below the surface. But if you know the waters like I do, you can catch some real monsters down there. It was a cloudy afternoon when I decided to make the trek down to the bend. I had the day off, and I figured I'd try my luck for a few hours before heading home. I packed my gear, grabbed a couple of beers, and set out down the trail. The woods were thick, the kind that makes you feel like you're miles away from civilization, even though the nearest town's only a few miles off. I've always liked the solitude of it, the quiet, just me and the river. The path to the bend was overgrown, like nobody had been down there in years. That didn't bother me. In fact, I liked the idea of having the place to myself. As I got closer, though, I started to notice something odd. The air felt heavy, like there was a storm brewing, but the clouds overhead were still just gray, not threatening rain. It was the kind of stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When I got to the bend, everything seemed normal enough. The water was calm, a slow current swirling around the rocks. I set up my rod and cast out, then sat down to enjoy the quiet. But the longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first I thought it was just the isolation getting to me. But then I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Movement on the opposite bank. I squinted, trying to see through the trees, but I couldn't make out much more than a dark shape, just standing there. It was too far to tell if it was a person or an animal, but whatever it wasn't moving. Just watching, I tried to ignore it, focusing on my line, but I couldn't shake the sense of being observed. Every time I glanced over, the figure was still there, standing perfectly still. After a few minutes, I started to get frustrated. I figured it was just some hunter or hiker messing with me. So I stood up, waved, and shouted, "Hey! You need something?" No response. The figure didn't move. I sat back down, trying to focus on my fishing. But that's when things started getting really strange. The wind picked up, making the trees sway and creak, but the air around me felt colder than it should have been. The sky was getting darker, but not from the clouds. More like the light itself was fading. I looked at my watch, expecting it to be getting late, but it was only 3:30 in the afternoon. Plenty of daylight left. That's when I noticed my line. It wasn't moving, just sitting there in the water, like I hadn't cast it out at all. I reeled it in, confused, and found my hook completely clean. No bait, no weight, just the bare line. I could have sworn I'd baited it before casting, but now I was second-guessing myself. I rebaited the hook, cast again, and sat back down. But before I could settle in, I heard something, like footsteps splashing in the water. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there. The figure on the opposite bank was gone too. I stood up, scanning the area, but the forest was silent again. Too silent. No birds, no bugs, just the sound of my own breathing. The river seemed different now. The water was darker, almost black, and the current had slowed to an eerie stillness. I decided I'd had enough. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but something didn't feel right. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, casting one last glance across the river before I started back up the trail. That's when I saw a shape rising up from the water, just where the figure had been standing. At first, I thought it was just something caught in the current, but then it moved, lifting slowly from the river, like it was crawling up the bank. It didn't have a face, just a dark, wet shape, dragging itself toward the trees. I didn't stick around to see what happened next. I grabbed my stuff and bolted up the trail. The entire way back, I felt like something was following me, the air thick with that same heavy, oppressive feeling. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. I haven't been back to the bend since that day. Whatever was there watching me from across the river, it wasn't human. I've been fishing at this lake since I was a kid, ever since my uncle showed me the spot. It's tucked away deep in the mountains, a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, and even further off the beaten path once you leave the main road. We used to joke that it was a family secret because no one else seemed to know about it. The water was clear and the fish were big. Some of my best memories growing up were from our summer trips there, casting lines off the old wooden dock and spending days in that peaceful isolation. As I got older, life got in the way, and I stopped visiting the lake as often. Work, relationships, responsibilities, they all seemed to pull me further from the things I used to love. But after a particularly rough breakup, I felt like I needed a reset. The lake was the first place that came to mind. So I took a weekend off, packed up my gear, and made the long drive up into the mountains. I got there late in the afternoon, the sun already hanging low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the water. It felt good to be back, like I was reconnecting with an old friend. I set up camp quickly, knowing I had just enough time to get a few casts in before it got too dark. The first few hours were perfect, just like I remembered. The fish were biting, and the quiet was a welcome change from the constant noise of the city. It wasn't until dusk that things started to feel off. I noticed the wind had picked up slightly, sending ripples across the lake's glassy surface, and a chill ran through the air. I didn't think much of it, but there was something different about the place. As the sun set behind the mountains, the shadows around the lake grew longer, and the stillness took on a different tone. I was standing on the dock, casting my line, when I saw a shadow pass beneath the surface of the water. It was quick, barely noticeable, but big enough to catch my attention. Too big for a fish in this lake, that's for sure. I brushed it off at first. Maybe it was just my imagination, or some large branch carried by the current. But then it happened again, this time much closer to where I was standing. I squinted at the water, trying to get a better look, but with the fading light, it was hard to see anything clearly. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. A few minutes later, I felt a sudden jerk on my line. Hard. My rod bent under the pressure, and I had to grip it with both hands to keep from losing it. This wasn't like any bite I'd ever felt before. Whatever was on the other end wasn't thrashing or fighting like a fish. It was pulling, slow and deliberate, dragging me closer to the edge of the dock. Panic started to rise in my chest as I struggled to reel it in, but the line snapped with a loud crack, sending me stumbling backward. I stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the water, expecting to see something break the surface, but there was nothing. Just the calm, dark water. I packed up my gear quickly after that, deciding I'd had enough fishing for one night. But as I turned to leave the dock, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A shape floating just below the surface of the lake. At first I thought it was a log, until I saw a face, bloated, pale, and lifeless, with dark, sunken eyes staring up at me. I froze as it slowly drifted toward the edge of the dock. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its features were distorted, twisted in a way that I couldn't make sense of. And as I watched, the face sank beneath the water, disappearing without a sound. I didn't wait around to see if it would come back. I grabbed my gear, ran back to my campsite, and didn't stop until I was safely inside my tent. I barely slept that night, every little sound outside making me jump. By morning, I was packed up and out of there, swearing I'd never return to that lake. I told my uncle about it when I got back, hoping for some kind of explanation, but he just shook his head. He'd been fishing at that lake for decades and had never seen anything like it. But there was something in his eyes, a look that made me wonder if he knew more than he was letting on.